Welcome back, boils and ghouls. Tonight you're in for a real treat. For some people, comics are a hobby or a way to make a living. To others, they're a passion. Then there are those for whom comic books are a way of life. To these individuals, making comics is like drawing breath. They're simply an inexorable part of their existence. While rare, this is most certainly the case for Gary Carlson. For over 4 decades, he's been an integral part of the independent comic community, helping launch the careers of not one, but 2 Image founders, as well as publish their flagship titles in his own books nearly half a decade prior to the launch of Image, aptly earning himself the moniker the Godfather of Image Comics. While Gary Carlson might not enjoy the monetary success of some of his peers or even former employees, Gary Carlson is one of the earliest, important, and least discussed aspects of the history of Image Comics. Not to mention, he's left a rather impressive body of work in his wake during his lengthy stint in the industry, if I do say so myself. Yet it's sadly one I hear discussed all too infrequently. Gary Carlson is undeniably one of the most interesting and important figures in independent publishing from the last several decades, but he just never seems to get his dues or recognition, in my opinion. With this in mind, I give you the complete story of Gary Carlson's career and another one of the greatest stories never told. A tasty tidbit of industry insight and intrigue I call Gary Carlson, the Godfather of Image Comics. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, hit that like button. Think about getting in the comments section below and letting me know. If you really enjoy what you see, make sure you smash that subscribe button. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the Ko-Fi link below, signing up for my Patreon page, or you can even get your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen. But now, let's get into it. Gary Carlson's father worked for the Social Security Administration and moved every 2 or 3 years for a promotion, which meant that Carlson grew up in various Midwest cities until the family finally settled about 40 miles outside of Chicago in Hanover Park, Illinois. While he spent much of his childhood on the move, Carlson's love of comics was ignited at the early age of only 5 years old when Carlson's older brother and his friends began to let him read their comics. At that point in the early 1960s, Gary Carlson was mostly consuming DC publications like Superman, Batman, and Flash, which would be found in his brother's comic collection, but Carlson also found himself very much drawn and enamored with adventure strips like Flash Gordon featured in the paper at the time. When he began to buy his own comics for the first time, Carlson began to gravitate towards the Avengers initially, but his love of the classic DC publications that he was exposed to at such a young age never really wore off. Not only would Carlson's love of classic DC comics remain a constant throughout his life, but as the years passed and his admiration of the medium grew, Carlson quickly began to dream of becoming a cartoonist himself. His desire to get involved with comics may have remained simply a dream, but when Carlson was 9, he saw the 1966 Jack Lemmon film How to Murder Your Wife. The film showcased the lavish, cushy life of a successful cartoonist in a posh loft, dating beautiful women and painting an intoxicating portrait of the fame and money that came along with the success of a syndicated newspaper strip. Upon seeing the film, Carlson instantly knew he had found his calling. Not long after seeing How to Murder Your Wife, Carlson also happened upon a postcard by cartoonist Clyde Yeadon featuring his comic strip The Mighty Bunyan. Yeadon was from the very same town in Upper Michigan where Carlson was born, and he took it as something of a sign and became convinced that cartooning was not only his dream, but an attainable one from an extremely early age. Now, a lot of kids dream of becoming a cartoonist and making comics, but not a whole lot of them actually end up doing it. Carlson, however, proved to be something of a different breed from an exceptionally young age. By the time he was in junior high, Carlson was not only editing, but contributing original strips to the newspaper as well, something he would continue to do throughout his high school years, refining his writing and art all the while. Carlson was obviously determined to become a cartoonist, but was also acutely aware of the dedication and the effort that it took to do so. Upon graduating high school, Carlson's original plan was to attend the Kubert School, but he didn't want to spend several years away from his high school sweetheart, instead eventually settling on attending 2 semesters at the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts during this first stint in college studying cartooning. Following this, Carlson took some time off of school to marry his high school girlfriend and secured work for R.R. Donnelley in 1997, who were at the time the largest publishers in the world. R.R. Donnelley would not only prove to be a way for Carlson to make a steady paycheck, but it was also a step towards making his own publication possible, as he familiarized himself with the various aspects of what was required to produce a professional publication, as well as the equipment to do so. After a break to marry and get his career off of the ground, Carlson decided that it was time to go back and finish college, initially enrolling to study animation. This, however, was simply too time-consuming for Carlson, who was still working a full-time job on top of juggling his recent marriage. As pressures mounted and he found himself increasingly frustrated with animation, Gary Carlson soon shifted focus back to his original loves of cartooning and illustration instead. After shifting his studies from animation, he would continue to further refine his artistic and storytelling skills as he had done throughout junior high and high school, skills that would become vitally necessary only a few short years later, although Carlson would not know it at the time. During this second stint in college, Carlson often frequented a local comic shop, Moondog's Comics, which was located only about 15 minutes from his house. After spending a great deal of time hanging out at Moondog's, reading, and eventually talking comics with others at the same place, he soon became acquainted with the manager, Chris Ecker. Ecker, who by chance was also an aspiring cartoonist, seemed to be something of a kindred spirit, and the two quickly struck up a close bond. The two men would quickly go on to form a lifelong friendship and working partnership that would change not only their lives, but the entire face of comics as we know it, in my opinion, even if neither man could have known it at the time. Given how well they got along, their mutual love of comic strips and books, how taken Gary Carlson had been with Ecker's work, and especially Carlson's nothing if not prolifically creative nature, it was only a matter of time before they were kicking stories, ideas, and concepts back and forth and working on strips of their own. As passionate as he was, Carlson, as I said, was working a full-time job, had a young wife at home, and was still trying to finish college. In fact, despite plans to already be finished with college, Carlson inadvertently ended up winning a scholarship for some political cartoons that he'd done and was offered a free master's degree, adding nearly 2 years of unplanned schooling to his collegiate career. While he was happy enough to have been given this opportunity the scholarship allowed him, it even further restricted the time and effort that Carlson could allot for his endeavors with Ecker, which were becoming increasingly tighter and more cohesive. As a result of Carlson's limited time, despite the fact he'd gone to school for illustration and cartooning and had always planned on getting into the field, Chris Ecker ended up tackling art duties while Gary Carlson handled writing duties on the numerous strips that the two would subsequently go on to create. The first of these strips that Carlson and Ecker were trying to get off of the ground was called Quagmire, about a wannabe writer and his parrot. Then came Scrimshaw and his pirates, followed by Major Discovery, and finally Rocket Rudy. The parrot even did illustrations for a proposed book called How to Use a Unicorn, which played on the popular 101 Uses for a Dead Cat. However, the unicorn illustrations, like their first few strips, went mostly unnoticed and remain unpublished. Eventually, however, people began to take note of their work, and the LA Times expressed a very real interest in syndicating their pirate strip, Scrimshaw. Realizing that this might be his one and only shot at attaining his childhood dream and doing what he loved professionally, despite being in his final semester of college, Carlson decided to take time off of school for the first time to instead concentrate on getting Scrimshaw picked up. He reasoned that if the Times picked Scrimshaw up, school would be something of a moot point, and if they didn't manage to get the strip syndicated, he could always just go back and finish his last semester anyways. After months of work, putting school and his life on hold, Scrimshaw was one of 3 strips considered for publication by the LA Times, but they eventually ended up going with another one. Carlson was then left to pick up the pieces of the life he'd basically left in limbo for the better part of a year while trying to get the strip picked up. Operating mostly on autopilot at this point, I think, and still trying to figure out his next move, Carlson returned to finish his master's degree. Or at least he tried. It should have been a simple proposition. All he had left was his final thesis and a gallery show. When he went to re-enroll, however, he was greeted with some rather troubling news. Carlson was informed that the master's degree program had been taken over by someone entirely different, and that if he wanted to graduate, he would be required to go back and complete a number of classes and other work that he'd previously done. Deciding that he learned what he needed from school and that the master's degree was essentially just a formality at this point anyway, Carlson left college, and while continuing to learn more about the publication process at R.R. Donnelley, he began to invest every moment of his newfound free time into his work with Chris Ecker. As Carlson and Ecker poured more and more of themselves into their work, they grew increasingly serious about it, but acutely aware of some serious problems that they faced as well. By this point, the prestige and the money of most syndicated strips were beginning to fade. There were outliers, but it was a far cry from the blockbuster industry it had been only a few decades prior. More than a little frustrated by their experiences with the Times involving the Scrimshaw strip, by 1981, Carlson and Ecker decided to shift their focus from comic strips to comic books. While independent publications had always been a part of the comic book landscape, they were usually fanzines, often mimeographed or later Xeroxed and assembled clumsily by hand. This is not to say that there weren't borderline professional fanzine publications or to belittle those other publications either, because I think that they're extremely important, and stories like this one illustrate that. Unfortunately, they were almost always of an inferior quality due to their very nature as fan-produced items lacking serious funding behind them in most cases. Some lone guy in a house in Timbuktu who had no clue how a proper book was put together just wasn't going to be able to pull off a professional publication. Even when people like Wally Wood got into self-publication, they would often favor black and white, magazine-sized pieces as opposed to traditional newsprint color comic books for a few reasons, but much of which being cost. By the late 1970s, the limitations for fans producing their own material was changing and beginning to take on a decidedly more professional look. They shifted focus, and books like Warp Graphics' ElfQuest in particular began to catch Carlson's eye. ElfQuest was something of a game changer when it was introduced, and the care and quality that the Peonies put into the book not only paid off in spades, but impressed a lot of people, Gary Carlson being one of them. The thing that most impressed Carlson was that, published on actual newsprint, and with its impressive color work and tasteful design, ElfQuest could easily and actually sit on a shelf next to any mainstream publication of the day with relative ease. Suddenly, just as when he'd seen the Clyde Yeadon postcard as a child, Carlson now knew that making his own completely professional comic book was possible. Carlson wasn't alone in recognizing that there was room on store shelves for publications like this either. During the 1980s, there would be a number of extremely successful, well-remembered, and influential independent publications that started what would become a full-on boom only a short while later produced, but this wouldn't be until several years later. At the time, seeing the potential to produce a book that could sit on a shelf and actually compete with something that Marvel or DC put out for the first time on his own, Gary Carlson and Chris Ecker began a monumentally difficult undertaking, and one that would change the very course of comics forever. In late 1980 or early 1981, Gary Carlson began to assemble the material and artists that he would need to produce his own comic book anthology. Still working his full-time job at R.R. Donnelley, Carlson knew he was still far too busy to handle the art side of things, and as such opted to write the material and look elsewhere for the artists that he would need. Carlson had a rather discerning eye and was looking for truly eye-catching artists that would help him stand out on the stands, but he also knew he didn't have $1 million to hire big-name professionals. Luckily, in the tumultuous world of the early 1980s comic book scene, Carlson felt like he was constantly running into people who were either right on the cusp of becoming professionals or should be there already, and he was not wrong. Carlson was an avid attendee of local Chicago comic conventions and quickly started scouting for artists who were shopping their samples at shows there. Having been a fan of his work for some time, Carlson first recruited Mike Gustovich for the Megaton Story Pulsar project, and he was officially off to the races putting together his first publication. Longtime friend and collaborator Frank Fosco was among the other initial talent Carlson recruited from the convention circuit, while he found Butch Geist via a Heroes Convention poster featuring Wolverine that he'd done. While he found a lot of people at conventions, he recruited others having noticed their ads in the Comic Buyer's Guide, and many of the artists that contributed to Megaton were already kind of working professionals and making a living at what they did. Some people like Dan Reed were just happy to be getting paid for their work though. Reed was working for Charlton at the time in order to get samples for bigger publishers and wasn't even getting reimbursed for his time and effort. Given the chance, Reed would go on to handle a host of duties from pencils to inks on Carlson's upcoming title, Megaton, throughout its run. Despite others like Ken Landgraf, Gene Day, and Ralph Cabrera also contributing to the first issue of the upcoming series, definitely the most well-remembered of the original Megaton alumni is Erik Larsen. Despite the importance of his contributions to the series, Larsen wasn't even originally meant to be a part of Megaton, funnily enough though. Production of the first issue was actually going fairly smoothly, but at one point there was a major problem with the story, The Night of the Skull. Unhappy with his work, the original artist charged with producing the story backed out, deciding that he wasn't right for it after only a few pages. In a somewhat unorthodox move, rather than produce material that neither he nor Carlson were going to be happy with, the original artist instead decided to pass the material off to another artist that he felt was much better suited for the subject matter, an acquaintance of his named Erik Larsen. I know this sounds great today, but this was done without even really asking Gary Carlson. Thankfully, Gary Carlson was not only aware of who Erik Larsen was, but was also a big fan of his self-published graphic fantasy, and Carlson was immediately excited at the prospect of having someone of Larsen's talents involved with the publication. Ironically enough, Carlson told me that he had actually considered approaching Erik Larsen about Megaton prior to this, but thought that he either wouldn't be interested in the publication or that they wouldn't be able to afford him and decided against it. Be it fate or kismet, whatever, Larsen seems to have been destined to find his way to Megaton one way or another, and would go on to become an indispensable part of not only a great deal of the rest of the series and its legacy, but Gary Carlson's life as well. Once he got involved, Gary Carlson quickly decided the material that Erik Larsen had been provided with simply was not up to his talent level and needed some serious work. During a series of telephone conversations, Erik Larsen and Gary Carlson developed a new character concept and story, and together they fleshed out the character of Vanguard. Having come up with an original and general idea of who the character was, knowing even then the kind of talent that Larsen possessed, Carlson said that he simply, quote, turned Larsen loose on the story from there. The Vanguard story would be one of the rare Megaton stories where Carlson didn't receive sole writing credit, being one of only 2 in the first issue that he didn't write on his own, clearly demonstrating the faith that he had in Larsen from the moment that they started working together. And today, nearly 4 decades later, you can still hear the admiration and the excitement in Gary Carlson's voice when discussing this early collaborative effort. The story, which featured now legendary inker Sam De La Rosa, who provided inks for several of the early Megaton stories actually, I think turned out better than anyone involved had anticipated, and would eventually lead to a long working relationship between Carlson and Larsen that would span several decades, characters, and publishers. At the time in late 1982 or early 1983, with the problems surrounding the Vanguard story resolved and the rest of the work for the book done, Carlson was finally ready to start assembling Megaton for publication. Carlson hadn't been able to swing color because he was basically funding the entire thing himself out of his own pocket, and the book was a whopping 68 pages long. While Megaton was printed with black and white interiors to save money, color covers were obviously a must. Now, cutting corners wherever he could, Carlson used the experiences that he'd gained at R.R. Donnelley to cut the color separations for the covers himself. Then, along with his sole business partner, Warren Crow, they bought the necessary cameras and the film to shoot the covers themselves and proceeded to set up a dark room in Crow's basement for the express purpose of creating the Megaton covers. With the covers shot and the art finalized, Gary Carlson was finally finished with the Herculean task of putting together a comic book, but he didn't have a clue where to actually get it printed at. Carlson knew what he wanted it to look like and how he wanted it printed, but there weren't a ton of readily accessible people doing what he was doing that he could just go out and ask. Thankfully, one of the godfathers of underground comics came to the rescue, and Dennis Kitchen of Kitchen Sink hooked them up with their printer in Wisconsin. After more than 24 months of agonizing work, Gary Carlson unleashed his vision on the world. Disappointingly, despite all the money-saving methods that he employed, as well as the high caliber of work included in Megaton, especially compared to a lot of the other contemporary independent publications of the day, sales were underwhelming to say the least. Carlson had hoped to produce a comic book that was able to stand toe-to-toe with anything that Marvel or DC was putting out, and in many respects, he had succeeded, but for one reason or another, success would continue to elude Megaton during its all-too-brief 8-issue lifespan. This might not be surprising for a lot of independent books from this or any other time period, but it was the particular time frame in which Megaton was released that actually does make this a real head-scratcher. A few months after the first issue of Megaton was released, at the end of 1983, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles #1 hit the stands, and the comic book industry was forever altered. Not only would the series itself go on to become a multimedia sensation that's still going strong 40 years later, generating quite literally billions of dollars, but its release would also officially kick off what's widely become known as the black and white boom. Without digressing into an entirely other video, the black and white boom was in essence a glut of independent publications spurred on by the success of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles that followed in the wake of the latter's success. While this might not have necessarily been a bad thing in and of itself, the rushed hack jobs that were choking up comic book stands and the scores of solicited books that were never released proved to be rather problematic, not just for Carlson and Megaton, but for a lot of other independent material from the same period as well. It became increasingly difficult for retailers to know what to invest their money and their shelf space into as more and more utter trash was pumped onto the market, simply in hopes of cashing in on the success of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. After only a few short years, the black and white boom was imploding as people realized that there simply was not going to be another series like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and that the entire collector and speculation market that had sprung up around it as a result had produced virtually nothing that was holding value or genuinely interesting readers or collectors anymore. As a result, before long, it was an uphill battle even getting people to carry something that wasn't by the proven sellers like Marvel or DC again, even further hindering Megaton's sales as the series continuously failed to garner a wide enough reader base to allow it to transcend the limitations being placed on independent publications once more at this time. On top of disappointing sales, while Carlson had an undeniably good eye for artists, he might have had too good of an eye for his own good in some ways. By the time the second issue was released, Butch Geist was off working for Marvel. Geist would soon contribute a well-received Raw manual that quickly turned into a fondly remembered run on Micronauts with Bill Mantlo. This was great for Geist, who was playing in the big leagues, but difficult for Carlson, who struggled to retain artists and maintain the quality of work being produced for Megaton. This was a trend which would continue even as the series progressed, with the likes of Angel Medina, who joined the series for several issues starting on the 4th. Teamed with the fact that Megaton was an anthology book, so the characters were constantly revolving anyways, this ever-changing roster of artists really started to catch up with the series before long. Even according to Gary Carlson, it was hard for fans to know what kind of comic they were going to be picking up from issue to issue. I think this made it even more difficult for Megaton to get their foot in the door and probably played a fairly sizable part in their eventual demise. That's pretty ironic given the artists were only leaving because they were so good they kept turning pro. Rather than give up or end, Gary Carlson wanted to double down on his creations though. He'd initially created Megaton as an anthology starring 8 characters in hopes of spinning them all off into their own series should they prove to be successful enough. But with the continual loss of artists and frustratingly low sales, this seemed to be out of reach for the time being, even though Gary Carlson continued to try to fight and claw his way there. By 1986, Erik Larsen also left, contributing his final story to the 4th issue of Megaton, dealing another serious blow to the series. Rather than spell disaster as it might have, however, another up-and-coming comic book creator who would go on to rock the world of comics would soon join the Megaton ranks. Chris Ecker, whose Eben the Raven was being published by Now Comics, was also working as their art director when he received a package from an eager young artist looking for work full of Teen Titans and Legion of superhero pieces. The enthusiastic young man had potential that Ecker quickly recognized, but not having worked for him at Now, passed his portfolio along to Carlson instead. The young man, who you might have heard of, by the way, was none other than Rob Liefeld. Carlson was impressed with what he saw despite some, quote, goofy anatomy, but didn't think that Liefeld was quite up to doing work for Megaton yet. When he sent the portfolio back to Liefeld and told him this, though, it was on like Donkey Kong for the young artist. Within weeks, Liefeld had supplied another set of samples, this time including several characters from the Megaton series, which showed a dramatic improvement and was quickly followed by a third package, this one containing pinups of Ultraman and Ultra Girl, as well as a proposal for a 4-page Berserker story, and was done even better than the previous samples. Carlson said that the improvement between the samples wasn't just impressive, it was enough for him to hire Liefeld, which in and of itself is a little bit of a funny story, but we'll get to that here in just a second. Carlson ran the pinup as the interior cover for Megaton issue 5 and continued to encourage Liefeld, who he felt was just on the cusp of where he needed to be. Spurred on by this, Liefeld apparently called him out of the blue one day from Chicago while he was there visiting family. He asked if Carlson would be interested in getting together so he could look at some more of his artwork and discuss the possibility of some serious work. As it turned out, the young man was quite literally just that. Very, very young. Liefeld was in fact so young he didn't even have his driver's permit yet. But after talking with him, Carlson and Chris Ecker were both impressed, and Carlson finally gave him a script to take a shot at. While this initial story never saw print as drawn by Rob Liefeld, he did have a backup, Friend and Lovers, that was featured in the 8th and final issue of Megaton, however. The story was actually going to function as an introduction of Rob's talent to his readers because of a cast of characters for a series that he'd pitched to Carlson. While I have no doubt that Gary Carlson was impressed with his art and taken by his enthusiasm and his young age, one of the other reasons that Liefeld was brought into Megaton was because Gary Carlson saw the opportunity to expand his Megaton brand with a new series, with new characters that he didn't have to be solely responsible for writing. By the time that Gary Carlson hired Liefeld in late 1985, sales on Megaton were flagging to the point that he knew something had to change. Believing that the revolving cast of characters, despite the book's name being Megaton, as well as the constantly changing artists were the major problems, Carlson decided to begin spinning off the characters into their own titles, hoping that this would help to not only spur interest, but create a sort of brand for the Megaton universe. Not only would this be a disastrous misstep, spreading resources dangerously thin, but only 2 of these spin-offs would ever actually happen despite the time and efforts afforded to them. Wildman and Ram, and both titles would only last a paltry 2 issues. While these were the only series that ever got completed and saw print, there was a host of other material that Carlson had planned and even advertised to publish. There were going to be solo titles for Etherian and Vanguard, along with a second volume of Megaton, which I believe was going to be centered around Megaton and not an anthology, but they were all canceled before they ever reached completion. Another book, one which saw a number of solicitations and even had character bios published by the young Rob Liefeld, was advertised and at least partially completed, was the book Liefeld initially sold Carlson on, Youngblood. Yeah, that Youngblood. While Carlson said that the book was taking Liefeld forever to finish and he was likely going to have help penciling it, it was partially completed to the point it was planned and solicited, and there was a cover done. To the best of my knowledge, nothing from this version of Youngblood that wasn't published has seen the light of day, though. In fact, while Youngblood would obviously go on to be a big deal a few years later, at the time when orders for the Megaton special starring Youngblood only received initial orders of 200 to 300 copies, according to Gary Carlson. Despite featuring a cover by Rob Liefeld and Jerry Ordway, Gary Carlson knew he was fighting a losing battle. Despite the publication of Megaton Explosion, a promotional book in June of 1987, and issue 8 of Megaton in August that same year, working towards the release of Liefeld's Youngblood, Carlson finally had enough and tossed in the towel. One unreleased Berserker story meant for Megaton and completed by Angel Medina saw print in a short-lived magazine, Battle Axe, the savage magazine of adventure that Chris Ecker helped publish in 1989 through David Anthony Kraft's comic interview. but that was previously created material, I believe, and it was 2 years later. When a second issue of Battle Axe failed to materialize and money fell through, it killed Chris Ecker's plans to start his own imprint, Prime Comics, which was to feature, among several other titles, 2 issues of a Vanguard miniseries, Outpost Earth, which are completed but to this day have never seen publication or the light of day as far as I know. As the years passed and Gary Carlson's name failed to show up in any more publications, it seemed like we legitimately may never see him pop up in comics again. That is, until several years later, when a fortuitous change of fate would alter his trajectory in life radically. While Gary Carlson might not have been able to justify putting Megaton out, I think it's fair to say he'd been bitten by the comic bug. So, come 5 years later, when an unexpected spotlight was turned on him, he would do his absolute best to capitalize on the opportunities afforded to him. According to Carlson, he had been quietly watching the rise of Rob Liefeld, or as he called him, Robbie, and went to visit him at a local Chicago comic convention in 1981. He was so blown away by the turnout for Liefeld that he decided he might have one more run at this comic book thing. Truth be told, while a number of his artists and other colleagues had gone on to great critical acclaim, following the death of Megaton, I think that Gary Carlson thought his own time in the industry was over. Although a number of his previous employees had gone on to successful careers like Butch Guys, Rob Liefeld and Erik Larsen had become legitimate superstars by 1991. Liefeld broke the Guinness World Record for most issues of a modern comic book sold on X-Force with 5 million copies in August of that same year. After reaching nearly unprecedented levels of success at Marvel following a nasty confrontation where they threatened to fire and sue Liefeld if he released a book that he solicited, he decided to join forces with Erik Larsen and a few other Marvel superstar artists, including Jim Lee, Todd McFarlane, and Jim Valentino, and strike out on their own to create a creator-owned imprint where they could put out the books that they wanted without editorial interference, without worrying about the Comic Code Authority, and most importantly, where they could reap all of the benefits of a successful book, collecting all of the royalties rather than the paltry shares that Marvel and DC were offering. If you want to learn more about the details surrounding the formation of Image, make sure you check out my banned comic that started Image Comics documentary that I did a few years ago. And there's also some awesome information in the Jim Valentino and Dave Olbrich interviews that I did if you want to really deep dive on that subject as well. While many were skeptical when Image began, it was immediately clear it was going to be a sales juggernaut, with the first issue of Spawn selling an absolutely insane 1.7 million copies. While Spawn might have sold better than others, most of the original Image series sold 500,000 copies or more without even breaking a sweat when they started. Amidst the insane hype and astounding sales numbers surrounding the Image titles, there was also an increased interest in the Founding Fathers' earlier work for other publishers as well. While most people had Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man and Silvestri's Conan, Megaton had managed to slip mostly under the radar despite the fact that Image flagship titles Savage Dragon and Youngblood were originally published by Megaton, and it is considered to have both Erik Larsen and Rob Liefeld's first professional comic book work in them. With the rise of Image Comics came the rise of the collector again as well, and there was instantly a lot of people scrambling to get their hands on books like Megaton issue 3, which featured the dragon before earning his Savage moniker apparently, facing off against Vanguard in what was the first appearance of Larsen's signature character outside of his own self-published graphic fantasy. Having fallen on somewhat deaf ears when it was first released, Megaton was steadily picking up a cult status, and the involvement of both Larsen and Liefeld, as well as their Image creations, quickly earned Carlson the sobriquet Godfather of Image Comics. Nearly half a decade later, it seemed that Carlson's discerning eye for talent was finally paying off, as there was a spotlight cast on Megaton and his work in a very serious way. As momentum at Image continued to build and people wanted a piece of the action in any way that they could manage, it wasn't long before an inevitable offer came to Carlson to once again enter the comics field, a chance that Carlson pounced on, although it didn't necessarily come from where you might think, at least not at first. Publisher Don Chin, who actually had a story, I Scream, You Scream, We All Scream for Ice Cream, published in Megaton 2 way back in 1985, was the first to see the potential and managed to secure some unreleased material that had originally been intended for a Megaton special that had never been released, and subsequently put out the Megaton Holiday Special in 1993 via his entity Imprint, although because he had the work colored, the book wasn't released until the holiday season of 1993. Soon after, Caliber Press, who were expanding operations with 2 new imprints, approached Carlson with interest in releasing a Vanguard series reintroducing the character, which had starred opposite Larson's Dragon, now renamed Savage Dragon, and one of the most popular comics on the stands at the time. While plans for the proposed Caliber series pushed ahead, Carlson was also contacted by Erik Larsen with an offer for a Vanguard title through Image Comics instead. Understanding that the Image offer was definitely where he should be putting most of his time and effort, Carlson didn't outright turn down the offer from Caliber, however. Instead, he chose to pitch them on another character which had originally shown up in the pages of Megaton that I mentioned, Berserker. Carlson still had a wealth of unpublished images from the Megaton era, and the first issue alone would feature a cover and 10-page story by Angel Medina, as well as pinups by both Erik Larsen and Rob Liefeld, leaning heavily into the Image Comics explosion and the massive popularity of its founders. Things with Caliber went smoothly, if a little uneventful, but Carlson knew that sales at Image were routinely reaching truly staggering levels, and that's where he needed to be concentrating his efforts. Hoping for the best, the first issue of Vanguard for Image Comics was released in October of 1993. While sales were still undeniably strong, the initial luster of Image was starting to wear off with a lot of fans, and there was even a rather critical eye being turned towards what many considered to be rather lackluster stories and ill-conceived avatars instead of characters that were being pumped out onto the market with really reckless abandon at some points. Despite criticism from some, many of these early Image titles sold well, like really well. Some simply because of the speculators boom, with others enjoying the ability to prominently display the names of some of the most highly respected and sought after illustrators in the entire industry above the title. Vanguard enjoyed none of these commodities, however, and perhaps because it wasn't Vanguard's first appearance, or it didn't have one of the founders' names above the title, or maybe just getting lost in the shuffle, the first issue of Carlson's Vanguard only managed about 120,000 copies. That might not sound too bad, especially considering sales numbers today, but this was despite the title getting a pretty serious push from Image even prior to its release, with Vanguard being featured in a backup in the second issue of the Savage Dragon ongoing series, which also just so happened to feature a crossover appearance by the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which Image would go on to pick up not long after. While 120 was a far cry from the few thousand copies of Megaton that he'd been moving in the 1980s, the numbers were underwhelming, to say the least. But this was only the start of the troubles that seemed to plague the series. Even worse than the initial sales figures was Erik Larsen's dislike for the art. Larsen was apparently so displeased with Tom Coker's art for the first issue that he insisted he be immediately replaced for subsequent issues. Had Carlson called for another regular penciler or artist, this might not have been so detrimental to the series. Instead, Larson chose to employ a rotating cast of artists who would tackle the duties on subsequent issues, both leaving a somewhat sour taste in Carlson's mouth out of the gate and putting him almost exactly where he'd been with the revolving talent involved with Megaton that he had felt so detrimental to the series, finding its footing and readership years prior. While there's no denying there was a pretty incredible roster of talent called in to finish out the series, I also don't think it's difficult to see this constantly changing art did serve to undermine any sense of continuity or cohesiveness that existed between issues. As such, even now, 30 years later, there are a lot of misconceptions that follow the series around. While it's often cited that Vanguard was always intended as a miniseries, or that the problems surrounding the art are the reason for the Vanguard's cancellation, this simply isn't true. I mean, it might not have been cohesive, but the art was not bad for this series. How could it be with the likes of Tom Coker on the first issue, Jason Pearson doing the second, Joe Madeira the third, Rick Leonardo and Jimmy Palmiotti handling the fourth issue, along with help from Angel Medina, who tackled the fifth issue with longtime Sam Keith collaborator Jim Sinclair, and Andy Smith on the sixth and final issue. It wasn't intended as a miniseries either, a fact I confirmed with Gary Carlson myself. While the art didn't necessarily help tell a cogent and cohesive story, and there were obviously problems behind the scenes, it was the fact that Vanguard started actually losing money that led to its premature cancellation. As I mentioned, at 120,000 copies for the first issue, sales had been somewhat soft for an Image launch at the time, and apparently sales had begun to fall off rather steeply following the second issue on top of this. As the series continued, so did its downward trend. By the time the sixth and final issue was released by Image Comics in May of 1994, it was actually costing Gary Carlson money to release issues rather than making him anything. It's hard to pinpoint exactly why Vanguard didn't land with Image readers at the time, but whatever the reason for it, thankfully, Gary Carlson had not put all of his eggs in one basket. The deal with Caliber for the Berserker series was still going well, and even as things at Image were falling apart, new possibilities were about to present themselves as a rather interesting and important transformation began taking place. Caliber were in the middle of an expansion on a few levels. During the early 1990s, as they enjoyed the success of the boom, they expanded their line of comics and created several new imprints, including both Iconographics and Tome Press, as well as the little-remembered Gauntlet, which is where Berserker eventually saw a print several months before Vanguard was actually released in 1993. While the Berserker title itself might not be extremely well remembered today, Chris Ecker was about to change the course of both he and Carlson's careers in its pages. Tired of being told by art directors that he drew like a quote old man and that no one was interested in art characters or stories like that anymore, Chris Ecker asked Gary Carlson if they could lean into this angle with a backup story in the first issue of Berserker rather than run from it. He initially proposed a reworking of an old Megaton character, Crusader, renaming him Night Watchman and transforming him into more of a take on Marvel's Daredevil than anything else to fill out the necessary page count. When approached about the idea, Gary Carlson tentatively agreed, but I think ultimately he had a very different idea and take than Ecker had originally proposed. Carlson thought it would be fun to do a series that harkened back to the older DC stories that he had grown up reading, whereas if you look at some of the design elements, like the truncheons that the Night Watchman carries, Ecker had a much more Marvel-centric idea in mind. According to Carlson, another reason that he avoided using Ecker's original Marvel-based concepts was because 1963 was already doing that, and he wanted to avoid competition or comparison with the relatively small amount of other retro-based comic books on the stands in 1993. On top of the DC elements replacing their Marvel counterparts, Carlson also proposed that if you just added a K to Night Watchman, you basically had a perfect Batman analog. Carlson then suggested that if Ecker really wanted to lean into his proclivity of drawing from Golden and Silver Age art, that they should do a story in the style of Bill Finger's original Batman strips from the 1940s. This proposed concept eventually became the 6-page story, The Time Crimes of Grandfather Clock, published in the back of Berserker 1 in February of 1993. This trend would continue, and little by little, I think that much of Carlson and Ecker's focus on the title shifted from the titular character to these backups, which they felt a much deeper connection to and seemed to go over much better with fans for the most part as well. Berserker wasn't really making much of an impact. Sales on the series weren't abysmal, but they weren't anything to write home about either. Because of this, Gary Carlson and Chris Ecker were left alone to do what they wanted with the short black and white backups that they continued to produce for each subsequent issue, where they were to introduce a new Golden Age hero, slowly and I think subconsciously even creating their own roster of characters. Following the introduction of the Night Watchman in issue 1, Ultiman and Brotherhood both made appearances in issue 2 and 4 respectively, with the famous fanzine creation Dr. Weird showing up in issue 3 to round out these early appearances and creations. Ecker and Carlson knew from the beginning that it wasn't enough to just craft analogous homage characters and tell stories in familiar and recognizable classical comic book styles. With this in mind, they'd begun to involve something that would go on to become a calling card for their work in the future. They begun crafting a gigantic shared universe full of history and lore. They constantly referred to non-existent back issues, invented titles, and even made up publishers in the beginnings of what would quickly go on to form the Big Bang universe. As Berserker progressed and the two invested more of their time in the backups, by the time that the 4th issue of Berserker was released, there was actually more interest in the backups than there was in Berserker. They actually got so popular that special black and white ash can editions, which were super popular in the 1990s, of the short Brotherhood, Ultiman, and Night Watchman stories from Berserker were released in limited quantities for promotion of what was already being heralded as the Big Bang universe at Chicago Comic-Con at the Rosemont Convention Center in July of 1993. On the basis of the popularity of these backups with fans, both Carlson and Ecker began to repeatedly lobby with Caliber to be allowed to do an entirely retro-styled comic book emulating the Golden and Silver Age stories and characters Carlson had grown up on, Ecker drew so well, and were gaining popularity in the pages of not only Berserker, but 1963 with fans. Caliber, however, argued for several months, again and again, that no one was interested in retro-fashioned characters or stories. That is until April of 1993, when Image Comics actually released the sales blockbuster turned uncompleted cluster that was 1963 by Alan Moore. While 1963 hasn't necessarily aged extraordinarily well, and there is still a lot of bad blood over the way that Moore handled the series, which ended abruptly with no ending and other creators being legally prohibited from being completed by Alan Moore. While it's undeniable that a great deal of 1963's success can be attributed to Alan Moore's name simply being attached to the project, once sales numbers started coming out, it became very apparent that there were, in fact, a lot of people interested in reading about those types of characters and stories, and Caliber had been railing against that for months, fighting Carlson and Ecker tooth and nail. Had Carlson and Ecker been allowed to go ahead with their initial series pitch to Caliber 6 months prior, they may have gotten something to market on time to actually compete with 1963 or even beat the series to the stands and been able to soak up some of the residual sales that it would have drummed up by simple visual association. Sadly, this was not to be, and Caliber instead dragged their feet until the spring of 1994, when the first issue of Big Bang quietly made its way onto comic book shelves just as the Berserker series was ending with issue 6. Things at Caliber were changing once again at this time, and there was an influx of money for a second as they merged with Staber Corporations, most certainly best remembered in the comic book industry for their line of comics greatest videos hosted by Stan Lee and released throughout the early 1990s. Thanks to a distribution deal that Staber secured for Caliber through Walmart via a third-party distributor, there was even enough money to print the initial Big Bang series in color, and things actually seemed to be going really well. While the Berserker series had folded and the Gauntlet imprint was all but forgotten by Caliber, Carlson was given his own imprint for his upcoming Big Bang Comics projects. Fans were responding well, the Walmart deal got books out to a considerable audience of people, and Carlson even managed to collect the early Dr. Weird material in the Dr. Weird special, and Dr. Weird is kind of an outlier for Big Bang, being their only character that features an actual history and background reaching all the way back to the 1960s, and one of the few to be featured in his own solo titles more than once. While he wasn't able to get anything into print until the end of 1993, as it turns out, Carlson had apparently been trying to get Dr. Weird back onto people's radars for a considerable amount of time, interestingly. I had long wondered about the Big Bang Dr. Weird connection, and when I talked to Gary about it, he said that longtime collaborator and indie comic legend Richard Grass Green, who had lettered much of the early Megaton material, had been friends with Dr. Weird creator Howard Keltner for years, having lettered a great deal of his early adventures as well. When Megaton was nearing the end of its lifespan in 1987, Keltner had actually approached Carlson about resurrecting the Dr. Weird character after inking the only 2 issues of Grass Green's Wild Man to ever come out. Carlson thought that it was an interesting idea, and Ed DeGeorge wrote a script. It came upon A Midnight Fear, which was eventually penciled by Angel Medina and destined for publication in the upcoming Megaton holiday special in December of 1987, which of course never ended up coming out. As a result, the story sat unused for nearly 6 years before Don Chin approached Carlson about releasing the contents, even opting to have the entire book colored by Bill Mouse's studio in 1993. Probably realizing that Carlson and DeGeorge might be some of the only people on the planet interested in keeping the character alive, so to speak, shortly after the publication of the Megaton holiday special, around the time Howard Keltner was apparently diagnosed with terminal cancer, albeit unbeknownst to Gary Carlson at the time, he sold the rights to both Dr. Weird as well as his earliest printed adventures to Gary Carlson and to George in hopes of seeing his creation outlive him, so to speak. Carlson quickly published the aforementioned Dr. Weird special, collecting early stories from the 1970s written by George R.R. Martin and drawn by a young Jim Starlin, and followed that up with 2 issues of a Caliber Dr. Weird series featuring new material written by Edward DeGeorge, both in 1994, and both proudly bearing the Big Bang Comics imprint. Things seem to be going well with Caliber. Both Dr. Weird, the titular book, and a Night Watchman miniseries Graveyard Shift, all proudly displaying the Big Bang Comics imprint logo on their covers. They were even starting to get some guest covers from some of the greats. While the Shelley Maldoff cover fell through, issue 4 of The Big Bang, the last to ever be released in color, featured a freaking cover by the legendary team of Kurt Swan and Murphy Anderson. Just as things seemed to be picking up steam and there was some interest in the Big Bang universe as it slowly but surely expanded, The distributor responsible for the Walmart deal suddenly decided that they wanted in on the action in a big way. They informed Caliber that they wanted Gary Carlson and Chris Ecker to relinquish 1/3 ownership of the IPs that they created for Big Bang to them, 1/3 to Caliber, and retain a third to split among themselves, as well as presumably to George as well. Coming from an independent publishing background like he did, Gary Carlson was well aware of how little meat was left on the bone, and this was probably just going to be used as an easy opportunity for either the distributor or Caliber to bully he and Chris Ecker into doing whatever they wanted with the series and characters. With this in mind, they published a fifth and final zero issue through Caliber in May of 1995 before departing the company for good, although as Carlson recalls, it was at least an amicable parting of the ways. Ironically, this final issue at Big Bang probably features two of the most iconic Big Bang images ever created. A friend of Gary Carlson's owned an original Mary Marvel painting by Alex Ross that Gary Carlson thought they could actually pass off as a Thunder Girl piece with some recoloring. Upon asking Ross, who was not only contributing covers to Astro City at the time, but had just recently completed and released Marvels and was in the middle of Kingdom Come, Ross replied that sounded like a lot of work. Instead, he just offered to paint an entirely new cover, an offer Gary Carlson happily took him up on, though he may have been better served to sit on it for a few months until the move to Image, where I think it probably would have received a great deal more attention and praise. If this wasn't enough, the proposed Shelley Moldoff cover, which was going to be the cover to the unreleased next issue, ran as the back cover instead, making Big Bang Comics one of the most stacked releases Carlson ever managed. I think seeing the writing on the wall and probably not wanting to turn down an offer from Rob Liefeld, Gary Carlson had begun scripting for Supreme the year before, but finished his run only 4 months after he left Caliber in August of 1995. While Gary Carlson would contribute scripts for much larger properties like Supreme, it's not something you hear brought up often for one reason or another. This push towards involvement with more mainstream books, which probably promised to be much more regular and better paying work, was a trend that Gary Carlson would continue to pursue for the next few years, though for reasons that evade me, he never really achieved much success in this department despite being in a few positions where he really should have been recognized and seen for what he was. One of the reasons for this may be that I don't know how attached or much effort that Gary Carlson ever put into being kept on a series. It really feels like when he just wasn't able to make ends meet with Big Bang and his own projects, he would pick up stuff like Supreme and a host of other work with Erik Larsen, especially later, to pay the bills, thereby letting him do what he really wanted, which was just to make his own stuff the way that he wanted to and be left alone to do it. Unfortunately for Gary Carlson, there weren't many places in the mid-90s landscape that were letting you do that kind of thing, and independent distribution was dicey to say the least in those early days of the internet when you still had to build mailing lists and contact every single shop personally that you wanted to carry your book if you were not being handled by Diamond Distribution. Fortunately for Gary Carlson, Image Comics just so happened to be one of those places, and he had not one, but two friends that he'd helped out early on, now in a position to return the favor in a big way. Despite initial good reactions when it was released, as well as a good relationship with his publisher in the beginning, after only 5 issues, the fate of Big Bang hung precariously in limbo. Thankfully for us all, Erik Larsen would once again enter the situation and radically alter things. As it happened, Larsen was a big fan of what Carlson and Ecker were doing with Big Bang, aside from one issue that he apparently pretty much despised, and invited Gary Carlson, Chris Ecker, and Ed DeGeorge to Image to publish a second volume of the series. There, they could retain 100% of the rights and revenue generated by the property and had absolute free reign to go wild with their ever-evolving made-up history and continuity for books that never existed. That is, provided that they never do another modern age version of Big Bang comics as seen in issue 4 of the Caliber series. The issue was mostly aimed at the Image age and whether he wanted to avoid confusion or simply didn't want another book in the Image house style on the stands. Erik Larsen was apparently pretty much forthright that this iteration of the Big Bang universe was not to pop up while they were being published by Image. Carlson and Ecker, who truth be told, I don't think were very tied to the modern era of continuity to begin with, given their shared love of the golden and silver ages of comics, and the entire reason that they even started Big Bang to begin with, and as such quickly agreed launching Big Bang Comics an impressive 12 months later in May of 1996. This second volume through Image was also initially printed in color. However, problems quickly developed for the niche publication once again after only a few issues. This time, rather than a distributor stepping in and wanting a piece of the pie though, after only a handful of issues, Big Bang was barely breaking even. After only 6 issues, when the final numbers came in, Carlson and the rest of the Big Bang crew actually ended up owing Image for printing and coloring costs by November of 1996, just like with the Vanguard series only a few years prior. Trying to wait things out and hoping for a small influx of cash when a second ill-fated Vanguard miniseries, Strange Visitors, that had debuted in October of 1996 for Image, underperformed as well. Gary Carlson suddenly had literally zero money coming in and was in fact starting to lose money on the entire proposition of making comics again. Quickly looking for a way to save every penny that they could, Big Bang ditched color, switching interiors to black and white, and while this helped them to not go into debt with the book, they would spend the better part of the next half dozen issues or more just paying Image back what they owed them for the initial 6 color books. It was a frustrating time, and for good reason. In 1996, the preeminent comic book publication at the time, Wizard Magazine, which could seemingly make or break you with a few simple plugs, even went so far as to release a reprint of Megaton issue 3 featuring Erik Larsen's Savage Dragon's first appearance through their Wizard Ace edition of historically important comics as well. Despite people's continued interest and fascination with Erik Larsen and Rob Liefeld's early work, and the fact that his publication kept getting brought up, frustratingly, Gary Carlson found there was little that he could do to capitalize on the interest that surrounded his own properties for a plethora of reasons, unbeknownst to me or him. With this in mind, Carlson continued to make his push further into more mainstream publications that might afford him more regular and hopefully better paying work. When Mirage stopped publication of the title and the Archie Adventure series was canceled in October of 1995, seeing the response to their appearance in his Savage Dragon comic, it was initially hoped that Erik Larsen could contribute both art and writing for a new Image relaunch of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles under his highbrow imprint there. When it became clear that he would be unable to handle the series, though, Erik Larsen suggested Gary Carlson and old Megaton alumni Frank Fosco for the jobs of writer and artist, and the two would actually go on to oversee the entire Image highbrow run. It's hard to imagine, but for the first time at this point, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were seemingly passé, and the entire franchise was in a massive slump. Again, unfortunately for Carlson, sales on the Image highbrow Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were so underwhelming from the very beginning that by the time issue 18 was released, a little over a year and a half later, Gary Carlson and Frank Fosco knew it was only a matter of time before the series was canceled, which it was only 5 issues later, with issue 23 leaving the story on a perpetual cliffhanger most people thought we would never see a resolution to. A decade later, thanks to IDW and a few dedicated fans, that would all change, but we'll get there soon enough. During this time, Gary Carlson also wrote the dialogue from Mars Attacks Image with Keith Giffen. He did a few issues of Nova that he co-wrote with Erik Larsen, and there was even a short 4-issue stint on Aquaman with Larsen as well in 1999. In fact, it seems Larsen was continuously feeding Carlson work during this period to make sure he was able to make ends meet, as well as having Vanguard making pretty regular appearances in other Larsen publications. Carlson did some work on the main series, as well as got some of his material printed as backups in Savage Dragon during this period, but nothing seemed to work. With the title hardly breaking even, it was a tedious and difficult prospect for Carlson trying to make any sort of living off of comics, despite the amount of effort that he was putting into the material and that he was seeing published. Once the initial move to black and white to save costs was made, the second thing to go was the art budget, as it was the only other major cost that they could cut. This is when Big Bang began including a number of creator-owned characters that belonged to the artists working on the series, and basically had absolutely nothing to do with Chris Ecker, Carlson, or DeGeorge. Carlson and Ecker had spent years building up their versions of the Gold and Silver Age of comics that had its very own distinctive style and feel. As a result, sometimes these creator-owned characters really worked and fit in with things, and other times they didn't. Regardless, it was increasingly difficult for Carlson to argue with their inclusion, as there was so little money that most people were working more for the love of what they were doing than a paycheck. Surviving the bankruptcy of Marvel and the complete implosion of what was left of the 90s comic book market, Big Bang just wasn't making any money, and it was pretty obviously a labor of love, and a fairly impressive one at that, if I do say so, with this second volume managing to last 9 years, spanning 35 issues and 7 one-shots between 1996 and 2005. They tried a few things to expand the Big Bang brand a little bit and spin characters off into their own series during this period. There was a 4-issue Night Watchman mini containing material which had originally been serialized but never completed by Caliber Press, as well as the 52-page Ethereal Warriors Vanguard one-shot, and Larsen even got Carlson to do a series of Mighty Man stories as backups in Savage Dragon, which would later be collected in the December 2004 Mighty Man one-shot special, but nothing seemed to capture audiences' attention. Towards the end of the second volume at Image, it was getting more and more difficult to break even again, and by the 7th one-shot in 2005, Carlson was back to owing Image money for printing costs when things were said and done. This was something he just was not comfortable with, and he knew it was time for an agonizing reappraisal of the situation. Carlson decided that if he was going to actually owe people money for putting out his stuff, it was probably better to just calculate and take on those costs himself rather than end up owing a company like Image money for product that there was no guarantee of ever selling and had to be produced in mass quantities. With this in mind, Carlson took around a year off to figure out what he was doing before self-publishing bi-monthly issues of Big Bang Presents between July of 2006 and August of 2007. After only a year and 6 issues, though, Carlson knew that this approach wasn't working either and decided it was time to go back to the drawing board once again. Following this, it was a while before Carlson's name would show up in the pages of a comic book again until he began contributing a series of Etherean and Vanguard backup stories that appeared periodically between 2009 and 2015 in the pages of Savage Dragon. The stories for the backups were actually already done, as it had originally been meant for future issues of the Image Vanguard series from 1993, which had been prematurely canceled and didn't require a lot of effort on Carlson's part to provide Larson with, while keeping him still in the public eye and his name in the pages of printed material. While he did have material, as we've discussed, showing up in Savage Dragon, things were looking fairly bleak for Gary Carlson. Thankfully, during this period, sometime in 2010, Gary Carlson was introduced to what would ultimately become a game changer for him: on-demand publishing. Mort Todd, who had done the Protoplasm Man stories from Big Bang, used a company called Kablam to do some reprints of that material, as well as their online distribution sister site, Indie Planet. Carlson was intrigued by the idea and would go on to use Kablam to print 2 issues of National Guardians, as well as the 2011 Night Watchman one-shot Skeletons in the Closet. Carlson was impressed by the quality of the product that he received from Kablam, but didn't utilize the online distribution system that they had in place with Indie Planet at the time, limiting the online marketplace for his book and relegating him to still having to kind of hustle for sales himself mostly. Likely because of this, Carlson chose to continue to try and work with publishers instead of working on his own. Pivoting gears, Carlson and Ecker would team with Pulp 2.0 in 2011 to produce a series of trade paperbacks collecting previously released Big Bang material. Specializing in the repackaging of Pulp and other retro mediums for a new generation, the Pulp 2.0 partnership proved to be a rather prodigious one, producing 5 wonderful deluxe-style edition trade paperback volumes, which included hosts of unreleased art, histories of the characters, and in many cases even unreleased stories on top of the material itself, some of which had been unavailable for decades before slowly and finally coming to an end a few years later. Following the Pulp 2.0 trades, Carlson and Big Bang lie dormant for a short while before being approached by AC or Americomics in 2015 to revive the brand once more. While AC is mostly known for their licensed property material, it actually started as an experimental independent imprint back in 1969 under the name Paragon Publications. Paragon was basically a way for owner and publisher Bill Black to have fun and produce weird and interesting titles such as Bizarre Thrills and Sin the Girl from LSD. Paragon expanded in 1983 and released their first line of Americomics in full color to compete with the black and white boom, as well as tap into the new direct market, but ended up overextending themselves pretty badly. They switched the entire line over to black and white and introduced their most popular series, this still running FemForce, in 1984, and have, like Gary Carlson, in many ways basically struggled to keep that series afloat since then. They've gone from black and white to color and back again, spanning 200 issues over nearly 40 years. There had obviously been some ups and downs, and no one was getting rich off of FemForce, but my point is that AC definitely had some experience in the kind of matters that they were handling here, and upon closer inspection of the line, they had a few ideas when it came to the retooled Big Bang that they wanted to release. The chief thing that they wanted to change was that rather than the traditional 20 to 30 page books Carlson had been regularly producing for years now, AC wanted to return to 64 page monsters that they could charge $9.95 for. The reason for this apparently had to do with the sales expectations of Diamond Previews, who at the time had entirely monopolized the comic book distribution system. While Carlson got along well enough with AC and they managed 3 specials between 2015 and 2017, it was a constant struggle to meet the expanded page demands. Carlson was getting older. There was virtually no money involved in the deal for him or anyone else. It was getting more and more difficult to recruit talented, cheap artists for these longer stories, and ultimately, in Gary Carlson's eyes, he just felt like it became more trouble than it was worth. It wasn't long after the release of the third and final book in 2017 before Gary Carlson came to the same conclusion that he had frustratingly come to so many times before. If they were not making money, and they were constantly struggling to meet deadlines and to keep the publisher happy, it was better to just cut losses, set out on his own again, and eat whatever money might be involved himself. While Gary Carlson tried to regroup and kind of figure out his next move with Big Bang, in 2018, IDW made a fairly shocking announcement and began reprinting all 23 issues of the Image highbrow volume of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles under the new name Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Urban Legends, and in full color for the first time nonetheless. This was legitimately kind of crazy. As a guy who lived through its initial release, worked at a shop, and remembers the heat that this series drew, the Image highbrow Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles has long been considered one of the low points for the Turtles over the years. Even Gary Carlson says it's often referred to as the quote-unquote black sheep, receiving some rather scathing reviews at the time, to say the least, concerning Gary Carlson and Frank Fosco's treatment of the Turtles and their changes and evolution over the series, to the point that it was not only non-canonical, but almost entirely ignored by both fans and publishers following its cancellation in 1999. Over the years, the series had slowly been garnering a reputation for having been sadly overlooked when it was originally released, despite ending on a perpetual cliffhanger, which was never resolved, as well as being unfairly judged simply because it didn't look or feel like the Mirage or Archie Comics or the cartoon. In 2011, when IDW started publication on probably the most fan-beloved volume of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles since the original Mirage years, they had little idea of the hit that they were going to have on their hands, and as the years went on, they were constantly looking for ways to cash in on that series' popularity by sticking the Turtles into just about anything that they possibly could. This apparently included not only reprinting the original Image highbrow volume, but getting Gary Carlson and Frank Fosco together again to produce 3 additional issues that would finally provide a conclusion to the series, which had hung in limbo for nearly 19 years. This was something I don't think that anyone saw coming, Gary Carlson and Frank Fosco included. Just about at the same time as the final Urban Legends issue was released, Carlson finally made his decision on what he was going to do with Big Bang again as well, ultimately relaunching it as a print-on-demand title under the name Big Bang Adventures starting in September of 2019. Instead of pulling money out of his pocket or aligning with another publisher this time, Carlson utilized the Kablam printing services he had been so pleased with previously on the National Guardians and Night Watchman series back in 2011. When Carlson relaunched Big Bang on demand via Kablam, he also made the decision to move all the distribution for the series to their sister site, Indie Planet. It had been getting increasingly more difficult for him to get books into comic shops since the late 80s, and the move to Indie Planet meant that he would no longer have to labor over distribution like he had in the past, not to mention it alleviated the out-of-pocket expenses that were incurred when you printed your own books for the most part, that may or may not sell, and it even eliminated his need to deal with the headache that was Diamond Distribution to put his books out anymore. The quality of the on-demand product was top-notch in Gary Carlson's eyes, and while there still wasn't much money being made, there never was, and Gary Carlson was much more comfortable with this new arrangement. Working on his own schedule, as always, constantly and reliably producing books, before long, there was enough interest in the on-demand material that fans seemed to be primed for even more Big Bang. In September of 2020, at the urging of the younger readers, Carlson and Ecker launched their first Kickstarter campaign. The Kickstarter campaign wasn't exactly for a Big Bang, though, and rather centered around characters that were descendants of people who had been mutated by the radiation that had given Ultiman his powers. Unlike Carlson's other creations that populated the Big Bang universe, the new characters were not pastiches or homages to pre-existing characters and were instead completely new and original creations. This in and of itself I don't think was actually a problem, and tying the cause of the characters' mutations all the way back to the plot in Megaton issue 1 was a brilliant move. Naming the series Anomalies, though, and thereby not tying it by title back into either Megaton, Vanguard, Ultiman's solo material, or even the Big Bang universe itself might have been one of the major things that killed the campaign, which for the record only reached about 50% of its modest $4,800 goal. This despite the entire first issue already being completed and the second issue being in the process of lettering when the campaign launched. Like they said in the Kickstarter description, though, it didn't really matter if the Kickstarter reached its goal. The book was going to come out one way or another, which it did through their on-demand service a short while later, I might add. Now in his 60s, having seemingly finally found a publication and distribution system that not only worked for him, but didn't cost him exorbitant amounts of money out of his pocket, Carlson was content with the low-impact on-demand system that they now had in place for Big Bang Adventures. After years of constantly changing publishers and various different incarnations, at 21 issues and going strong, it finally feels like Big Bang and Gary Carlson have found their home. It might not be the most glamorous existence, and there's still no money in the deal for Gary Carlson, who, when we spoke, explained that most of the profits from the book goes to providing comp copies to artists who are contributing material. It can be a tedious prospect putting in so much work for so long and not really seeing a monetary return, watching many of those around you, especially people that you hired and mentored and published that same material for, rise to the levels of prominence of Erik Larsen and Rob Liefeld. It might be embittering or at least frustrating to a lesser man. Gary Carlson seems entirely unfazed by it all, though. He's not upset at the lack of money or prestige. He's not off-put by the time and the effort that it takes to make these books that can only be described as true labors of love at this point. Exactly the opposite. For Gary Carlson, making comic books is like breathing. It's what he knows, what he loves. After 2 bouts with cancer, and now in his mid-60s, I'm sure there will come a day when Gary Carlson stops publishing comics himself. When he hands the book off to younger, more able hands. All great things come to an end, but I am happy to say that today is not that day. Over the last nearly 4 decades, Gary Carlson has become a staple in many comic book readers' diets. A constant that you can always rely on to be doing something, somewhere, for someone. As this documentary is being produced, Image is releasing a trade paperback collection of the original 8-issue run of Megaton with material already assembled for a second volume, including some unreleased stuff if the first is successful. And Gary Carlson is also working on compiling and reprinting the Dr. Weird material that he and Ed George have been the loyal custodians of for the last several decades, keeping Howard Keltner's name and his ghostly creation alive. Gary Carlson's legacy might not be as filled with prominence, money, or power as those of some of his contemporaries, or even former employees for that matter, but Gary Carlson's legacy will stand the test of time as generation after generation continue to find his work. And I hope that this piece has helped you appreciate his story a bit more. Thank you so much for sticking with me. I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, do me a favor and hit that like button. Think about getting in the comment section below and letting me know. And if you really enjoyed what you saw, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel, think about using the link in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page. For as little as $3 a month, you get access to tons of behind the scenes posts, exclusive material like an interview with tonight's subject, Gary Carlson, and you can even get your name in the credits. If Patreon is not your thing, have no fear. You can sign up for membership right here on YouTube, or you can use the Ko-Fi link to make one-time donations towards specific goals, or just tip the channel. If that's not enough, you can even get your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen now. Patrons, memberships, and other donations really do make these episodes possible, and I want to thank each and every one of you that puts your hard-earned money into supporting me and my videos. I hope I'm doing you all proud. I apologize for my absence. I am back. As always, this has been a product of the Jerk Broadcasting Company and made possible by the generous donations of the patrons and YouTube members that you see on the screen right now. I'd also like to personally thank my loyal Wednesday warriors, Channel 10, Super Chasen, and Sergey Paez. Thank you again for sticking with me. There's more content to come, I promise. I hope you all enjoyed, and as always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only two things. Keep hitting those local shops, and keep reading comics.